Dawn arrived gently over the village, the way it always had. Thin light spilled across shattered rooftops and collapsed stone walls, illuminating streets that Allied maps now marked with a single, confident word: cleared. The gunfire had moved east days ago. The flags had changed. By every measure available to an advancing army, the danger here was finished. At the edge of the village, where the last intact building surrendered to open ground, a child stepped into the morning. He was 3 years old, too young to understand front lines or retreating armies, too young to know that silence could be engineered. He walked because children walk, because the field was empty, because nothing in his world suggested it should not be. What the ground contained was invisible. Anti-personnel mines, buried hastily by a retreating force with no intention of returning. Small, efficient devices designed not to stop tanks, but to stop people, boots, legs, the habit of walking forward. They had been placed according to logic, spacing, and doctrine. The war had written equations into the soil, and then moved on. U.S. infantry approached the village with trained caution. Their steps were measured, their confidence borrowed from engineers who had swept roads and intersections, who had followed procedure and checklists. But no one had walked this particular patch of earth. It lay just far enough from the road, just insignificant enough to escape notice. War often hides in margins. At the far end of the field, a German shepherd stood motionless. Its silhouette was sharp against the pale grass, ears raised, body fixed in a posture that did not belong to a stray. Soldiers noticed it immediately. Experience had taught them that animals knew things maps did not. Someone shouted. A warning, urgent and sharp. The child did not turn. He could not understand the sound or its meaning. He took another step, unaware that each footfall carried weight far beyond his own. Beneath him, pressure plates waited patiently, indifferent to age, allegiance, or intention. The mathematics of the mind did not allow for innocence. In that suspended moment between warning and consequence, history narrowed to a single point, a step that should never be taken. And as the soldiers froze, they were about to learn a truth the war had not yet finished teaching them. Liberation does not end when armies pass through, but when the ground itself is finally made safe. The German shepherd broke from cover without a sound. It moved with purpose, not speed crossing the edge of the field as if stepping onto familiar ground. Its body placed itself squarely between the child and the open space beyond, not blocking him with force, but positioning itself as an obstacle that could not be ignored. There was nothing wild in the animal's posture. Its back was straight, its weight evenly distributed, its head low but steady. This was not fear, nor was it aggression. It was the stance of something trained to understand consequence. Soldiers, watching from the roadside, felt a tightening in their chests because they had seen this posture before on airfields, near supply depots, in the hands of handlers who trusted dogs more than diagrams. The child laughed. He reached out, delighted by the sudden appearance of a companion in the quiet morning. For him, the dog was not a warning. It was a game, a moving shape where the field had been empty seconds before. He stepped closer, small hands extended, turning the geometry of danger into play. Every soldier froze. Rifles lowered, then forgotten. Training manuals spoke often about explosives, but rarely about moments like this. Someone whispered the word mine, though no one needed to hear it aloud. Another soldier watched the animal's eyes focused not on the child, but on the ground beneath them both. Slowly, deliberately, the shepherd lifted one paw and lowered it into the soil ahead. Not with weight, not fully, just enough to touch. Then it stopped. The paw hovered, trembling slightly, as if the ground itself had spoken back. That was when understanding spread through the group, not as panic, but as clarity. The dog was reading the earth, smelling metal, oil, disturbance, sensing patterns laid by men who believed they would never return. The animal knew what the maps did not. In that silent standoff, instinct stood against doctrine. An unmarked field challenged the authority of cleared routes and signed reports. And as the soldiers held their breath, watching a child and a dog suspended between motion and disaster, it became clear that survival, once again, would not depend on orders but on something older, quieter, and infinitely more fragile. The engineers moved first, not running, not hesitating, advancing with the careful urgency of men trained to treat every inch of ground as a question. Probing rods slid into the soil at shallow angles, hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The field, moments ago dismissed as empty, became a surface to be read rather than crossed. The first mine appeared almost immediately. Its metal casing lay less than a foot from the child's shoe, close enough that the outline seemed unreal, as if it had always been there and simply chosen this moment to be seen. The engineer brushed soil away with his fingers, slow and precise, revealing a pressure plate no larger than a man's palm. Then they found another, and another. The pattern emerged quickly, too quickly. This was not a stray device forgotten in retreat, but a belt. A deliberate line of anti-personnel mines laid to delay pursuit, missed in the chaos of rapid advance and incomplete sweeps. Doctrine had failed not through negligence, but through haste. Throughout it all, the German shepherd did not move. Its muscles remained locked, eyes fixed on the disturbed ground, body coiled in silent warning. It did not bark. It did not retreat. The animal seemed to understand that stillness itself was now a form of protection. The child was lifted away at last, small arms flailing, confusion turning to tears as unfamiliar hands carried him back toward safety. He cried not from pain, but from the sudden violence of rescue, from being pulled out of a world that, to him, had made sense moments before. Behind him, the field waited, unchanged. With each exposed device, belief replaced disbelief. This was no oversight. It was evidence. The field was reclassified in quiet voices, not as terrain, but as a grave that had narrowly failed to open. The map would be redrawn. The word "cleared" would be erased. When the engineers finally withdrew, the dog remained. It sat calmly amid the danger, as if awaiting instructions that would never come. And in that stillness, the soldiers began to understand that survival in modern war was no longer just about firepower, but about seeing what had been deliberately hidden and trusting those who could. To understand why no one moved the dog, the story must rewind a generation to a different war and a different kind of desperation. During the First World War, when artillery fire severed telephone lines and runners were cut down between trenches, armies turned to animals that could cross chaos without hesitation. Dogs carried messages through smoke and shellfire, navigating landscapes where men could not stand upright. They did not question orders. They simply ran. The lesson was not forgotten. By 1942, as the Second World War widened and hardened, Germany, Britain, and the United States had all formalized canine military programs. Kennels were built alongside barracks. Training manuals were written, revised, and standardized. Dogs were no longer improvisations. They were assets assigned serial numbers, handlers, and roles within the machinery of modern war. German shepherds were favored almost universally. They possessed a balance armies prized: intelligence without fragility, obedience without panic. They could learn complex tasks and retain them under stress. Their nerves held under gunfire. Their senses, especially smell, extended human perception into spaces maps could not reliably describe. Mine detection became one of their most delicate functions. Dogs were trained to recognize the scent of explosives, the oils used in metal casings, and the subtle disturbances in soil that followed hurried emplacement. They learned not just to find danger, but to stop before triggering it. Success depended on restraint as much as discovery, a quality difficult to teach and impossible to fake. On paper, the manuals were clear. Dogs were described as tools. Valuable, yes, but expendable. Their purpose was to reduce human loss, even if that reduction came at an animal's expense. The language was clinical, designed to prevent sentiment from interfering with efficiency. But soldiers rarely spoke that way among themselves. Handlers spent every hour with their dogs training, feeding, sleeping nearby. In the long pauses between movement and contact, bonds formed quietly, without ceremony. Men learned to read posture and breath the way others read instruments. When a dog stopped, they stopped. As the war progressed, faith in technology expanded. Metal detectors improved. Procedures tightened. Maps grew more detailed. Yet belief in instinct never fully disappeared. Machines failed. Orders lagged, but animals responded to the present moment. Standing at the edge of that field, watching a dog refuse to move, the soldiers were not witnessing something new. They were seeing a lesson learned slowly across decades of conflict, one written not in manuals, but in survival. And soon, that belief would be tested again, under conditions no training had fully prepared them for. As German forces withdrew across occupied Europe, their tactics changed in character as much as in scale. What they left behind was no longer intended to hold territory, but to wound time itself. Minefields became punctuation marks in retreat, silent, unseen barriers placed not to stop an advance forever, but to slow it, complicate it, and exact a cost after the decision to move on had already been made. These mines were laid quickly, often under pressure, sometimes at night, sometimes by units already breaking apart. Documentation was inconsistent. Maps were incomplete or never drawn at all. The logic was simple: delay pursuit, force caution, by hours or days. Whether anyone would later remember where the devices lay was a problem deferred to the future. That future arrived almost immediately. Civilians returned to villages as soon as the fighting passed. Fields were needed for food, roads for movement, children for normality. The war receded just enough for life to resume, without waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The ground, however, remained loyal only to its last instruction. Allied doctrine struggled with this reality. Cleared roads were assumed to mean cleared areas. Engineers worked methodically, but time pressed constantly against caution. The pace of advance demanded trust in procedures, in reports, in the belief that danger could be neatly categorized and removed. Often, that belief held. Sometimes, it did not. Statistics compiled after the war would reveal an uncomfortable truth. Landmines killed and maimed more people after battles ended than during them. Farmers, children, returning refugees, those with no role in the fighting paid the price of weapons designed without discrimination. The mine did not know when the war was over. It only knew pressure. In this way, the minefield became a moral weapon. It waited without hatred or intent, affecting anyone equally. It transformed victory into something incomplete, something provisional. Liberation could be announced, but safety could not be guaranteed. Peace existed on paper, while danger remained underfoot. For soldiers who encountered these fields, belief began to shift. Success was no longer measured solely by ground taken or enemies defeated, but by what remained behind, unmarked, unresolved, and still lethal. The war was ending, but it was not finished. Standing in that village, watching a field that should have been harmless reveal its true nature, the men began to understand that retreat had its own strategy, one that did not require occupation, only patience. And somewhere ahead, in the path of continued advance, this lesson would demand to be learned again. The dog wore no collar, no tags, no visible markings that tied it to a unit, a handler, or a chain of command. In an army built on identification and order, its presence was an anomaly. It existed outside paperwork, outside structure, an unclaimed asset standing calmly in the middle of a lethal field. When spoken to in German, the shepherd reacted, not with obedience, but with recognition. Its ears shifted, its eyes sharpened. It understood the language, but did not submit to it. Commands were acknowledged selectively, filtered through a judgment that did not belong to any regulation. This was not a lost civilian animal. This was something trained, and then separated. Speculation followed quietly. Someone suggested the dog had been abandoned by a retreating unit, left behind when vehicles were destroyed or routes cut off. Another proposed something more unsettling, that the animal had deserted, not out of fear, but out of refusal. The war, after all, made demands even animals could recognize as final. What was certain was its behavior now. When offered food, the dog did not eat. It sat near the edge of the field, body angled toward where the child had stood moments earlier. Only after the boy was carried well beyond the danger did the animal relax, lowering its head, tension easing from its frame. Hunger, it seemed, was secondary to resolution. Among the soldiers, discussion turned cautious and low. Protocol was clear enough. Unassigned animals were not to be kept. Strays posed risks, disease, distraction, unpredictability. Yet nothing about the shepherd felt stray. It had prevented a disaster. It had done so deliberately, without command, without reward. War regulations strained under the weight of that reality. The manuals did not account for judgment exercised without rank. They did not describe loyalty that operated independently of orders. And yet, every man present understood that strict adherence to procedure would have produced a different outcome. one written in blood rather than after-action reports. The dog remained where it was, patient but alert, as if awaiting a decision it could not influence. In its stillness, the soldiers were forced into their own struggle, not against an enemy, but between doctrine and common sense. The war had trained them to obey systems. Survival now asked them to trust something unsanctioned. Eventually, someone made a choice. Not official, not recorded. A quiet adjustment in behavior rather than a declaration. The shepherd would stay, at least for now. The field would be cleared properly, and the march would continue, altered slightly by an animal with no unit and no orders. In the distance, the advance pressed on. New ground waited, and with it, new dangers that no map could fully explain, only reveal, one instinct at a time. The engineers began to follow the dog, not closely, not at first, but with attention sharpened by necessity. They watched the shepherd's movements the way cartographers once watched coastlines take shape. Every pause, every hesitation, every slight change in angle was noted. The animal was not wandering. It was tracing something invisible. Where the dog stopped, probes followed. Where it adjusted its path by inches, engineers marked the ground. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that no printed map had captured. Each step the shepherd avoided corresponded to buried metal, to disturbed soil, to danger disguised as normal earth. The field was no longer empty. It was annotated. The animal worked without haste. Its head stayed low, nose close to the surface, reading the ground through scent and pressure and memory. Wind direction mattered. When the breeze shifted, the dog shifted with it, adjusting approach angles to confirm what the air carried. Soil disturbed by hurried hands months earlier still spoke, faintly but clearly, to senses refined beyond human reach. The soldiers began to realize what they were witnessing. The shepherd was not merely detecting mines. It was actively clearing the field, mapping safe routes through restraint rather than removal. It understood spacing. It respected boundaries. It moved as if aware that a single mistake would end not just its work, but itself. Hours passed. No explosions broke the quiet. The absence of sound became its own tension, heavier with each careful minute. Sweat darkened uniforms. Knees stiffened from kneeling. The sun climbed. Still, the dog moved, paused, redirected, methodical, deliberate, patient beyond training. Trust shifted almost imperceptibly. At first, the men trusted their equipment, probes, flags, manuals. Now, they trusted behavior. They trusted the way the dog's body tightened before stopping, the way its ears angled when something beneath the soil felt wrong. Instruments confirmed what instinct had already suggested. The hierarchy inverted quietly. This was not how doctrine imagined innovation. There was no new device, no issued solution. Nothing had been invented. Instead, something had been observed. The soldiers learned not by commanding, but by watching, by allowing a different intelligence to lead. The field slowly transformed. What had been an undefined danger zone became a network of understood risks and safe corridors. Markers multiplied, notes were taken, procedures adjusted on the fly. The dog became the reference point against which all other readings were checked. In that process, something else changed. The war, which had demanded control through force and certainty, briefly allowed uncertainty to guide survival. The shepherd did not explain itself. It did not justify its decisions. It simply acted, moment by moment, in response to what it sensed. By the time the sun began to dip, the field had been rendered legible. Not safe, not yet, but understood. Engineers prepared to complete the work formally, to disarm and remove what had been found. The dog finally sat. Work done, breathing slow, eyes still alert. What had begun as desperation had turned into method. What had seemed an exception now looked like a lesson. Innovation, the soldiers realized, did not always arrive with authority or approval. Sometimes, it arrived quietly on four legs, asking only to be noticed. And as the unit prepared to move on, they carried with them a new way of seeing terrain itself, not as something to dominate, but something to interpret. Ahead lay more ground, more uncertainty, and somewhere within it, dangers that would again demand trust, not in machines alone, but in those who could read what others could not. The child's mother watched from behind a broken stone wall, her body held still by instinct rather than instruction. She had been told not to move, not to call out, not to cross the invisible line now dividing safety from catastrophe. Every part of her resisted the order. Every part of her understood it. War had reduced her role to witness. From where she stood, She could see the dog clearly, not as a soldier would or an engineer, but as a mother might. She did not see a trained asset or an anomaly without paperwork. She saw posture, distance, control. The shepherd was not aggressive. It did not corral the child or frighten him away. It allowed closeness, but never progress. The child had stopped crying. Confusion lingered, but fear had softened. He stood near the animal, hands resting briefly against its fur, then falling away. The dog tolerated the contact without shifting position, eyes never leaving the ground ahead. It was not guarding the child from enemies. It was guarding him from space itself. In that moment, the war collapsed into a single relationship. No flags, no languages, no doctrine. Just a child, an animal, and a stretch of earth that demanded respect. The scale of conflict that had drawn armies across continents shrank to a radius measured in steps. The soldiers noticed the change before they spoke about it. Voices lowered, commands shortened. Someone referred to the dog not as it, but as him. The language of procedure gave way to something more careful, more human. Men who had crossed beaches under fire now moved gently, as if volume itself might disturb the balance holding disaster at bay. A canteen was produced. Water poured slowly into a helmet, then offered by hand. The shepherd looked once briefly toward the engineers, then lowered its head to drink. Not deeply, not greedily, just enough. The mission, whatever shape it had taken, was not finished. The mother watched the exchange with an intensity she would remember long after the details of the uniforms faded. She did not know the dog's history. She did not need to. What mattered was intention. The animal had chosen stillness over safety, patience over hunger. In a world that had taught her how easily lives were spent, this restraint felt almost radical. Time stretched. The sun moved. The field remained unchanged, yet everything within it had shifted. The child's presence was no longer a threat, but a measure of how carefully each decision would now be made. The dog remained between him and the open ground, an unspoken agreement holding. For the soldiers, this was the struggle no training addressed. Not fear of death, but responsibility for life. Not how to advance, but how to pause. The war had taught them to move forward under pressure. Now it asked them to wait, to trust, to accept guidance from something without rank or voice. Eventually, the child was guided back to his mother, step by careful step, along a path the dog had silently approved. She took him into her arms without speaking, afraid sound itself might undo what had been preserved. Her gratitude had nowhere to go. It settled instead into memory. The shepherd did not follow. It returned to its place at the edge of danger, sitting once more, patient and alert. The field was quieter now, the crisis contained, but not resolved. And as the unit prepared for what came next, it was clear that this war, like this moment, would be decided not only by force, but by restraint, and by those willing to hold the line without being asked. By late afternoon, the field bore the signs of translation. Small flags stood at careful intervals, tracing the path the dog had chosen and the dangers it had refused. What had once been a blank expanse was now a marked surface, its meaning rewritten through behavior rather than instruction. The ground had not changed, understanding had. Engineers moved along the flagged route with renewed confidence, confirming what had already been suggested. Each marker corresponded to a buried device, each deviation aligned with disturbed soil or metallic scent. The pattern was accurate, not approximately, not coincidentally, but precisely. The dog had read the field as reliably as any instrument available to the unit. When the work paused, the shepherd finally sat. Its breathing slowed. Tension eased from its shoulders. For the first time since stepping into the field, it appeared relaxed, not exhausted, but complete. It had done what it came to do, though no one had ever told it to begin. No handler called it back. No command was issued to release or reward. The absence was noticeable. In a war defined by orders shouted over noise and fear, this moment passed in near silence. The dog had not waited for permission. It had not sought approval. It had acted. This was the turning point, though few would name it as such. Training had provided the foundation, discipline, restraint, recognition of danger, but training alone did not explain the decision to intervene, to place itself between a child and the unseen. What followed was not obedience. It was choice. Doctrine had never accounted for autonomy of this kind. Manuals described responses to commands, not the refusal to move when moving was expected. They outlined acceptable losses, not independent judgment exercised without human direction. The war had made room for many innovations, but rarely for those that operated beyond control. Yet the evidence stood plainly in the field. Lives had been spared not by superior force or better equipment, but by an unscripted decision made in the moment where it mattered most. The soldiers understood this instinctively, even if the paperwork never would. Something subtle shifted after that day, not in official policy, not in published doctrine, but in expectation. Engineers paid closer attention to behavior, not just readings. Handlers trusted pauses as much as commands. The presence of animals in combat zones was no longer seen solely as support, but as partnership. The war did not change suddenly. It never does. But in small, cumulative ways, its shape adjusted. Authority loosened just enough to allow observation to guide action. Control shared space with trust. The line between tool and ally blurred. The shepherd rose when the unit prepared to move. It followed not attached to any handler, not assigned a role, but accepted without argument. No one wrote its name down. No report captured the decision. It simply walked with them. As the village receded and new ground waited ahead, the lesson traveled quietly with the column. Training could prepare the body. Doctrine could organize the mind. But survival, in the end, still depended on choice and on recognizing it when it appeared, unannounced, from the margins of the war. As evening approached, the question could no longer be avoided. Officers gathered at the edge of the village, voices low, eyes drawn repeatedly toward the shepherd sitting quietly nearby. The immediate danger had passed. The field was marked. The child was safe. What remained was not tactical, but administrative and therefore more difficult. Regulations were clear. Enemy animals were not to be adopted, retained, or reassigned without authorization. Dogs trained by opposing forces were considered unpredictable, potential liabilities. War, after all, relied on boundaries between friend and enemy, asset and threat. The shepherd occupied none of these categories comfortably. Reality, however, pressed in from all sides. This was not a theoretical animal. It had acted in full view of the unit. It had demonstrated restraint, judgment, and consistency under conditions that defeated procedure. Removing it, or worse, destroying it as protocol technically allowed, felt less like enforcement and more like erasure. The debate unfolded without anger. No one argued passionately. That alone marked the moment as unusual. One officer cited regulations. Another cited results. A third said nothing at all, watching the dog instead. The war had trained these men to make decisions under fire. This one arrived in quiet. Nearby, the child broke from his mother's side and walked forward. This time, no one shouted. No one moved to stop him. The ground between them was known, now measured, flagged, understood. He reached the shepherd and extended his hand again, small and open. The dog responded differently than before. Its posture softened, its head lowered. It licked the child's fingers once, gently, without urgency. The danger that had defined their earlier encounter was gone. What remained was recognition, something mutual, uncomplicated by language or rank. That small gesture settled what argument could not. The officers did not announce a decision. They simply stopped debating. No forms were produced. No orders were written. The shepherd was not reassigned, not formally accepted, not officially recorded. It was allowed to stay. Authority, in that moment, yielded to consequence. The regulations had been written to manage risk. Here, they threatened to ignore it. The war had already demonstrated the limits of rigid control. This was another lesson, quieter but no less instructive. The dog was given water again. Food this time, too. It ate calmly, without haste. A place was made for it near the vehicles, not assigned, just available. The unit prepared to move at first light, as scheduled. Nothing in the plan changed on paper. Everything changed in practice. No one spoke about what might happen later, about reports, about explanations. Those concerns belonged to a future that felt distant and abstract. What mattered was immediate continuity, the ability to move forward with the knowledge gained rather than discard it. As night settled over the village, the shepherd lay down among the soldiers, head resting on its paws, eyes half closed but alert. It was no longer guarding a field. It was accompanying a column. In wars, turning points are often marked by explosions, breakthroughs, lines crossed on maps. This one passed without noise, a decision made without documentation, an authority quietly revised by experience. By morning, the unit would advance again, into territory equally uncertain. But they would do so changed not because of a new weapon or order, but because they had learned when to let judgment outrank instruction. And that lesson, once absorbed, would not remain isolated to a single field or a single dog, or a single child. By the following day, the shepherd no longer stood apart. Someone found a brush. Another produced a rag and water. The mud and dust of retreat were worked from its coat with quiet care, not as ceremony, but as acknowledgement. Food was shared without hesitation. A name emerged, naturally spoken once, then again, until it settled. No record marked the moment. The dog simply answered to it. There was no leash. None was needed. The shepherd followed the unit as if it always had, keeping pace without instruction, stopping when they stopped, moving when they moved. Its place in the column was unassigned but consistent, never too far forward, never lagging behind. It did not belong to anyone, and yet it belonged. Caution remained. War did not allow sentiment to outrun survival. Soldiers watched carefully as the dog encountered new ground-collapsed walls, abandoned equipment, cratered roads. Each reaction was measured. Ach, Pause deliberate. When it stopped, they stopped. When it passed safely, they noted the ground as passable. Trust was not given all at once. It was confirmed, step by step. Reliability proved to be the dog's most convincing argument. Not dramatic intervention, not heroics, but consistency. The shepherd reacted the same way every time. No false alarms, no reckless advances. It behaved as it had in the field where it first intervened, attentive, restrained, precise. The war rewarded predictability more than bravery. Engineers took notice, at first indirectly, then openly. Requests were made, not orders, but suggestions. Could the dog walk ahead of a sweep? Could it observe before probing began? No doctrine authorized the practice, yet no doctrine forbade observation. The dog's presence began to precede difficult ground, quietly integrated into routines that had once relied solely on equipment. What had been an enemy asset became, by simple accumulation of evidence, an allied protector. Not through retraining, not through reprogramming, but through continuity of purpose. The dog had not changed sides so much as it had revealed that sides mattered less than outcomes. War has a way of absorbing what it creates. Tools become liabilities. Liabilities become lessons. This shepherd bred, trained, and deployed by one army now moved with another. Its skills intact, its loyalties undefined, but its intentions clear. It protected whoever stood behind it. No one spoke of irony. The war had long since exhausted that vocabulary. What remained was utility shaped by conscience. The shepherd did not symbolize mercy or reconciliation. It symbolized adaptation, the quiet willingness to use what worked, regardless of origin. As days passed, the novelty faded. That, too, was a sign of acceptance. The dog was no longer remarked upon in reports or conversations. It was simply there. Another presence accounted for without discussion. Another factor considered before action. The uniform never came. No insignia, no patch, no official recognition. And yet, the dog wore something else routine. Expectation. A role shaped by repetition rather than decree. In a system defined by structure, this was its own kind of legitimacy. The column moved on through villages like the first, each marked by traces of retreat and the hidden dangers left behind. Sometimes the dog walked ahead, sometimes beside, always alert, always silent. The war continued to demand lives, but occasionally it permitted preservation. What began as an anomaly had become integration, an enemy creation redefined by circumstance. And as the shepherd settled into its place among the men, it was clear that the war had not merely changed its uniform, it had changed its meaning. The field was officially cleared 3 days later. Engineers returned with time, equipment, and documentation, working methodically where urgency had once ruled. Each device was exposed, disarmed, and removed according to procedure. Flags were replaced with reports. Coordinates were logged. The danger, at last, was rendered finite. When the paperwork was complete, the field reverted to its original classification. Not dangerous, not contested, simply ground again. On updated maps, no trace of the moment remained, only the quiet assumption of safety restored through process and patience. The casualty reports reflected this absence. No injuries, no fatalities, no amendments. The column moved on without adding names to lists that had already grown too long. In military terms, nothing had happened. And yet, everyone involved understood how rare that silence was. The child lived, He survived not just the incident, but the war that followed it. Years later, he would remember fragments, the dog's fur, the strange stillness, the way adults spoke more softly than usual. He would not remember mines, or maps, or doctrines, only that something dangerous had been stopped before it could finish its work. The village returned to life slowly, then all at once. Fields were planted, walls rebuilt, paths rewalked. The war receded into scars rather than daily reality. The minefield, once so precise and lethal, became a rumor, then a footnote, then nothing at all. History, efficient in its forgetting, moved forward. The dog did not leave. It became a constant presence within the unit, walking ahead when terrain changed, sitting back when it did not. Its role was never formalized, yet it shaped decisions quietly, repeatedly. Where it hesitated, men reconsidered. Where it passed easily, progress resumed. No commendations were issued, no photographs taken. The shepherd's contribution did not fit existing categories of valor or service. It had not attacked, nor defended, nor followed orders in a way that could be neatly described. It had simply prevented loss. War rarely marks prevention. It records damage. It tallies destruction. Survival leaves no monument, because it leaves no absence to explain. The field produced no ruins, no graves, no before and after photographs. Its most important outcome was invisibility. For the soldiers, the lesson lingered longer than the place. They moved differently afterward, not slower, but more attentive. They watched animals more closely. They questioned assumptions they once accepted without hesitation. The war continued to demand speed and decisiveness, but it had also revealed the cost of certainty. The shepherd aged as the campaign progressed. Its pace slowed slightly. Its pauses lengthened. Still, it remained present, embedded not by order, but by habit. When the fighting ended, it did not return to a kennel or a record book. It disappeared into peace, the same way it had entered the story without documentation. Years later, when the war was studied and summarized, the incident did not appear. No official history recorded a dog standing between a child and a minefield. There were no strategic implications to analyze, no operational shifts to credit, just a moment that had gone the right way. That is often how survival enters history, not as an event, but as an omission. A blank space where something terrible should have been, a field that remained empty, a step that was never taken. And in that quiet absence, the war revealed one of its rare truths, that sometimes the most decisive actions are those that leave nothing behind to remember them by. The unit moved forward at dawn, as it always did. Packs were lifted, engines turned over, routes were checked and rechecked. Nothing about the departure suggested a change in composition or mission. And yet when the column began to move, the shepherd moved with it, falling into step without pause, without signal, without acknowledgement. There were no papers to record the adoption, no entry in a logbook, no transfer of responsibility signed or stamped. The dog did not exist in the system that governed the war. It drew no rations officially, held no designation, answered to no handler. Its presence was an omission visible to everyone, authorized by no one. Logistics adjusted anyway. Portions were redistributed quietly, without discussion. Someone took slightly less. Someone else pretended not to notice. The arithmetic of survival, long practiced under scarcity, made room where it needed to. The dog ate at the edge of the group, never demanding, never rushing. Hunger had taught it patience. Acceptance taught it restraint. At night, when the unit halted, the shepherd chose its place carefully, not at the perimeter, not at the center. It slept near the youngest soldier in the group, a replacement barely old enough to shave, still learning the rhythms of fear and waiting. No one instructed this. No one commented on it. The dog simply lay down where the tension was highest and the experience thinnest. The effect was subtle, but measurable. Sleep came a little easier. Conversations stretched a little longer before silence returned. Jokes, dry and brief, surfaced more often. The presence of the animal did not distract from the war. It anchored the men within it. Morale is difficult to quantify, but the army tried. Reports tracked exhaustion, discipline, cohesion. None of those metrics included companionship. None accounted for the quiet reassurance of something that listened without judgment and stayed without being ordered to. The shepherd altered the atmosphere not by lifting spirits, but by steadying them. Statistics can never fully describe certain experiences. They record numbers, categories, and outcomes. But they do not measure quiet moments of rest. They do not note the calming of hands that once moved with tension. They do not account for the clarity that comes when exhaustion slowly fades. The shepherd continued to walk alongside the group through changing landscapes. Empty paths, weathered structures, roads marked with signs meant to guide rather than alarm. Sometimes it paused. Sometimes it continued forward. When it paused, attention increased. When it moved on, progress followed. Its judgment was not flawless, but neither was any system people relied upon. What set the dog apart was not accuracy, but presence. It did not withdraw when conditions became uncomfortable. It did not seek reassurance. It remained, and in doing so, reflected the value of steadiness itself. No one spoke of possession. The shepherd was never claimed. To claim, it would have required explanation and formality. Instead, it was allowed. Allowed to remain nearby. Allowed to share food. Allowed to walk alongside people whose journey it joined naturally. Kindness existed without permission. That was the quiet truth beneath the arrangement. In a system built on structure and rules, this connection survived because it had no label. It lived in the spaces where definitions did not reach. As time passed, the dog changed. Its pace slowed slightly. Its face grew lighter with age. Still, it remained attentive. Still, it stayed close to those who seemed to need it most. No announcement marked these changes. Time simply moved forward. Eventually, the group began to separate. People moved on gradually, not all at once. The shepherd stayed as long as familiar faces remained. And when it finally disappeared into a town, a home, or simply into memory, no record marked the moment. That quiet departure matched its arrival. The dog entered the story without documentation and left the same way. What remained was not proof, but influence. Years later, when people spoke about that period of their lives, this story was rarely told first. It appeared instead in pauses, in brief remarks, when conversations drifted towards small things that carried no official importance. A dog, a path. À simple moment, history often focuses on what can be recorded. Dates, lists, results. But beneath that surface exists another record kept in behavior, in quiet decisions, in moments where calm replaced tension. The shepherd belonged to that record, accepted without ceremony, remembered without display, a presence that never needed permission to matter. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson, that even in uncertain times, humanity does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply walks alongside, quietly, asking only to continue. Letters arrived months later. The child's family had found an address through indirect means, a name passed from one soldier to another, a location guessed more than confirmed. The letters were careful, translated, formal in tone. Gratitude expressed without embellishment. News shared sparingly. The child was alive. He was growing. He remembered the dog. Those letters were read more than once, then folded, then stored. Memory, already at work, began to simplify the story. Details blurred. Dates slipped. What remained was the shape of it. Danger, intervention, survival. The war receded into background noise. The moment stood alone. The shepherd aged in peace. Its muzzle grayed. Its hearing dulled slightly. It no longer paused at every disturbance in the ground. There were no minds here, no patterns demanding interpretation. Fields were just fields. The absence of threat did not confuse it. It adapted as it always had. There were walks, quiet routines, familiar hands. The dog slept more, watched less. The vigilance that had once defined it softened into presence. It had no uniform now, no role to perform, no function to justify its place. And yet, it remained. For the men who had known it in war, this was perhaps the most difficult transition. They had learned to trust the dog when survival depended on it. Now they had to learn to value it without purpose. Peace required a different kind of faith. Years passed. The story was told occasionally, then less often. It changed with repetition. Edges smoothed. Coincidences aligned. The dog became braver. The field more perilous. The ending cleaner than it had felt at the time. This was not deception. It was how memory protected itself. The shepherd died quietly, far from any battlefield. There was no marker connecting its life to the war it had shaped. No archive recorded its service. It was buried as animals are buried privately, without ceremony. The ground held no danger here. Nothing waited beneath the surface. Peace, it turned out, was harder to map than war. War drew lines, assigned roles, imposed meaning. Peace scattered those structures, leaving individuals to decide what mattered once urgency was gone. The shepherd had navigated that shift without guidance, just as it had navigated the minefield years earlier. In the end, its life resisted summary. It did not fit comfortably into categories of heroism or service. It had not followed a narrative arc designed for remembrance. It had simply acted when action mattered and then lived on. For those who remembered, that was enough. And perhaps that is why the story endured at all. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it revealed something ordinary that war often obscures. That protection does not always wear a uniform, that judgment can exist without command, and that survival, once secured, asks a harder question: how to live afterward. The war ended. The uniform disappeared. What remained was the quiet proof that some choices outlast the circumstances that force them, and that peace, like danger once was, must be learned step by careful step. Minds are designed without judgment. They do not ask who approaches or why. They do not distinguish between retreat and return, between soldier and child. Once buried, they exist only to respond. Pressure becomes consequence. Intention is irrelevant. That is their efficiency and their moral vacancy. A mind does not hate. It does not choose. It waits. And in doing so, it outlives the decisions that placed it there. Long after flags change and maps are redrawn, it remains loyal to a moment that no longer exists. Maps, by contrast, promise certainty. They reduce chaos into symbols and lines, offering assurance that danger can be contained, that knowledge can be complete. In war, maps are trusted because they must be. Movement depends on them. Survival often follows. But maps are abstractions. They record what was known at a specific time, by specific people, under specific pressures. They cannot account for haste, error, or the human tendency to believe that what has been marked safe will remain so. The field outside the village carried a promise the map could not keep. Training, too, has limits. It teaches obedience, repetition, discipline. It prepares bodies and minds to respond predictably under stress. This is its strength. It is also its boundary. Training cannot teach mercy. It cannot program judgment. It can only shape response to instruction. The dog had been trained well. That much was clear. It understood explosives. It recognized danger. It knew how to stop short, how to read ground and air and silence. But training alone does not explain what happened in that field. The shepherd did not act because it recognized an enemy. It did not intervene because it received a command. It did not weigh allegiance or uniform. It acted on recognition of vulnerability, of immediacy, of a life about to cross a threshold it could not perceive. That recognition was not strategic. It was not ideological. It was not even moral in the way humans define morality. It was instinct informed by experience, sharpened by training, but ultimately unconstrained by doctrine. The soldiers, watching, learned something their manuals had never articulated. Trust did not always flow downward from command. Sometimes it emerged laterally, from observation. Sometimes it rose upward, from those never meant to lead. They learned that authority could be revised without collapsing, that discipline could coexist with flexibility, that survival sometimes depended on allowing space for judgment to appear where no rule anticipated it. A child lived because instinct outran doctrine. That is the simplest truth of the story, and the most difficult to sit with. Because doctrine exists for a reason. It organizes chaos. It prevents hesitation. It saves lives precisely by limiting choice. And yet, in that field, doctrine would have failed. It would have insisted the area was cleared. It would have trusted the map. It would have allowed a step that could not be undone. The dog did not reject training. It fulfilled it and then moved beyond it. It used what it had been taught to recognize a moment that required more than obedience. It did not understand the war. It understood consequence. This is where the story resists comfort. It would be easier to frame the shepherd as a hero, to assign it intention or sacrifice. But that language belongs to human narratives. The dog did not choose glory. It did not seek meaning. What it did was simpler and therefore harder to replicate. It noticed. It paused. It refused to move. In war, refusal is rare. Everything is designed to push forward orders, momentum, fear. To stop is to risk delay, reprimand, uncertainty. The shepherd absorbed that risk without calculation. It simply held the line. The soldiers carried that lesson with them, though few would have named it at the time. They remembered the value of hesitation. They remembered that danger is often quiet. They remembered that not all wisdom arrives through rank. Years later, when the war was reduced to campaigns and outcomes, this moment did not appear. There was no designation for it, no medal that fit, no report that required its inclusion. And yet, its absence mattered, because the field remained empty, because the child grew older, because no one had to explain a loss that never occurred. They trained the dog to obey orders, but it chose to save a life instead. That line, repeated often, suggests defiance. But the truth is subtler. The dog did not choose against obedience. It chose before obedience could be invoked. It acted in the space where command had not yet arrived. That space exists in every conflict. It is where judgment must operate without guidance, where maps end and reality begins. War tries to eliminate that space. It cannot. What the dog knew was not strategy or politics. It knew proximity. It knew danger. It knew when not to move. In a conflict defined by movement armies advancing, fronts shifting, nations mobilizing, the most decisive act in this story was stillness. And that is the final irony. The war demanded speed, certainty, and obedience. What saved a life was patience, doubt, and restraint. They laughed once, perhaps, at the idea that an animal could understand war better than men. They never laughed again.